All right, well, it's good to see all of you guys who are logging in. We are talking today about the church life in the second and third centuries. For those who are in person and if you're online, flip to the back of the pages for this week. I think it's going to be page page 38. Just kind of we typically go over some vocabulary words and some terms that we'll talk about. A couple things we're going to talk about today that are going to come up is the term catechism. You may have heard that term, especially if you come from some different religious backgrounds. You probably heard that term used. The word just comes from the Greek word, which means instruction. And so what catechisms are is it's foundational instructions that kind of set the stage for an initiate to become a Christian. And to take part in the religious community and all of that. And so going side by side with a catechism are catechumens. And those are people that are going through the process of catechism. And so if you're a candidate for baptism, especially in this time period and in other traditions, then you might be called a catechumen, somebody that's going through those first steps of initial learning about the various teachings of the church and all of that. We're going to talk about sacraments a little bit today. The word sacrament itself is a word that comes from, it's a Latin word which comes from a translation of the Greek word, which means mystery. And so the sacraments is going to come to refer, we talked a little bit about this last week, about the development of the sacramental system, but that's going to come largely and develop into something that is a set of practices or events or rituals that come to be seen as imparting grace upon the person. And so last week we talked about the transition from the saints, all Christians being saints and being sanctified, to sanctification being through a sacramental system. And so that's still something that a lot of people teach today and a lot of people practice today. Typically, when we talk about sacraments, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but we talk about especially baptism and Eucharist, which is the Lord's Supper, communion. And that's our last term that we're going to talk about. The term Eucharist, I'm going to use that a little bit just because it's kind of the technical term that you see when you read these books and things that talk about this. But it's just the Greek word thanksgiving. That's all that it is. And it simply just refers to the Lord's Supper. And there's going to be a bunch of different beliefs about what this is and what it does and the exact nature of it. But when we talk about Eucharist, we're just talking about the Lord's Supper. And so those are just some words to have in mind as we get going in this. I know those are words we don't use too much, so hopefully that'll be a little bit of a help. So what we're doing today, we're talking about church life in the second and third centuries. A lot of us are very accustomed to our own religious contexts. We walk in a church building and we know exactly what we're going to be doing, and we know how things go. And sometimes we are so strict on it that, if you do two songs before the prayer versus one song before the prayer, well, you got some trouble. And so we're going to talk today not just about worship services themselves, but what it is, like to be a Christian in this time period. Some roles and those sorts of things. And then we're going to talk about some influential figures. Just like Christianity today, there's a big personalities that make a lot of sway and make a lot of wake. And so we're going to talk about some of those big personalities in this time period today too. So let's get into it, and we'll start. So let's talk about Christian initiation. How does somebody become a Christian? Well, in the New Testament, we see that there's some pretty clear instructions that are laid out, and we see some pretty clear patterns. The book of Acts, you see 9 different examples of non-Christians transforming into Christians. And there's been a lot that's been said about these, and we won't get into this too much, but a couple interesting takeaways is that all of these instances, all 9 of them, include baptism. They have some different ancillary factors, some other things that are mentioned, but all of them mention baptism, every single one of them. Significantly, every single one of these shows rejoicing. This is the natural outcome of salvation, right? You rejoice because you've been saved. However, in every single one of these instances, the rejoicing comes only after the baptism. And so it never happens before. Although you may have professions of faith and you may have confessions that are made, the rejoicing is reserved for after the baptism, which I think is significant. And you also see that when you talk about the conversion stories in Acts, we see that the people that are candidates for conversion are always people who are mature. We don't know exact ages of individuals, but they're people that have their wits about them and are able to communicate and think and reason and understand. I know there's been a lot to do about Cornelius's household is baptized along with him, and people have suggested that because his household is baptized, therefore there must have been infants that are a part of that and small children that are part of that. And that's just simply not the case. If you were to take a poll of 99 families and the majority of them are not going to have small children at home. Some certainly may, but it doesn't necessitate that there were children there. And so either way, when you look at the book of Acts, you see some clear indications of what Christian initiation looks like. It involves belief, and it involves confession, it involves repentance, it involves baptism, and that's a clear pattern that's set out. We've talked a little bit about this in some previous classes, but there's some interesting sources that talk about this beyond the first century biblical sources. A couple of those that we're going to look at. We talked about the Didache a couple weeks ago. Which is a early Christian writing, maybe to the very end of the first century, probably early second century, but it certainly talks about baptism and talks about Christian initiation to some extent. It talks about life as a Christian as well. You have Tertullian, and we're going to talk more about him today and give you kind of just a brief biography of him. He writes a work called On Baptism around 220, sometime before then, because that's when Tertullian dies. But sometime in that neighborhood, he writes this and gives a lot of really interesting details. Hippolytus, who we've talked about a little bit, he writes a work called Apostolic Tradition. And this is going to deal very heavily and very detailed depiction of what baptism is and what to expect in catechism and those sorts of things. And it's going to be really kind of interesting. We're going to read a couple excerpts from that. And so what you see, though, is that in the obviously the New Testament church, but also what you see in the coming centuries is that there's a general pattern to be expected in how this actually happens. You have at first a period of instruction or catechesis or catechisms. You have a initial period where there's a lot to learn about what being a Christian is. There's a lot to learn about what Jesus has said, a lot to learn about the church and church order and church structure and all these things. And all of these are very significant. And this would be a long period of time. This would be, up to 3 years of time that you would be under catechesis, where you're learning the basic fundamentals before you're permitted to be baptized, before you're permitted any further entry into the church. And it's a rigorous thing too. It requires a lot of outside attention on the way you've been conducting your life. And so if you're in a business that is perhaps a little bit seedy, you're going to be expected to cut that out, and you cannot have any part of that. There's examples and stories of brothel owners that are being forced to sell their business before they can become a Christian. And there's stories of people that are involved in trade practices that are a little bit dishonest, cooking the books just a little bit. And they are forced to repent from that very publicly and right those wrongs that they've made. And so there's a very strong external eye on you. You cannot just become a Christian overnight. We'll read a little bit about that in Hippolytus. And then after that, you have, after your period of catechesis is done, you've gone through it and you're approved, there's a period of preparation for baptism. And this is often, it starts the Thursday before the Sunday that you're going to be baptized. Typically, baptisms happen on Easter, and sometimes they happen throughout the year, but very often they would reserve it for Easter by this time period. And, you can remember from our discussion last week that there's a lot of question about Easter and about when Easter should be celebrated, and so there's a little bit of tensions here, you might imagine. But people would postpone baptism until Easter. And prior to it, there'd be a period of fasting and prayer and worship, and it would be quite an ordeal, and we'll read a little bit about that. And then baptism happens on Sunday. Baptisms typically happen in pretty large groups. You would have a bishop or a presbyter. Remember, there's the distinction by this time. Who's in the water. If you remember from our talk about the didache, there's some clear preferences in the type of water you're to be baptized in. It's preferable that you're baptized in cold running water, but if you don't have cold running water, then cold water will do. But if you don't have cold water, then hot water will do. And if you don't have that, well, in the extreme circumstances, pouring is permitted, is what the didache says. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But baptism was performed by the bishop or by the presbytery. Again, you have the beginnings of this clergy, laity type distinction that's beginning to emerge. And they would put their hand on the head of the person being baptized. There's a lot of interesting artwork that depicts this from roughly around this time, and they would dunk you under, push on the top of your head and push you under the water. And they typically, the way that they baptized in the nude, which is interesting. They would have separate baptism dates sometimes, and certainly separate occasions for baptizing men and women, because you would be baptized naked. You weren't allowed to bring anything into the baptistry or into the place you're being baptized, the river or whatever it might be. And so you're expected to take out all your jewelry, take off all your hair pieces, whatever it might be, to be totally naked when you get in the water. They would anoint you. They would make you, you would confess, which we talked about a little bit with the Apostles' Creed last week. That was a big part of the baptism process, is the confession. And interestingly, they would almost always triple baptize, triple immersion. You would be baptized once, and then another, and then another. And then, of course, there's the preference for living water. So that's the general rule of how it's done. That's not always how it's done, but that's the general rule for how baptism's done in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. There are some exceptions, and some notable exceptions are, pouring and sprinkling. We talked about that with the didache, which notes that in extreme circumstances where you have just an absence of water, then I guess you can pour, is what the didache essentially says. It doesn't recommend pouring, but it says that if you're in extenuating circumstances, then I guess that's what the best you can do. And sprinkling comes about even later. This is often paired with, again, the left exclusively for extreme circumstances in this time period, like deathbed baptisms. But you have a really interesting situation. Last week we talked a little bit about Novatian, who really kind of caused a big schism in the church there at Rome for a little while. He was very staunch against those that would be repentant after having abandoned their faith in the light of persecution. Well, Novatian had a deathbed experience. You know, he was dying and thought he was near the end, and he had a deathbed baptism through pouring. The problem is he didn't die, and he got better. And so then there's this big controversy about, well, you know, is his baptism valid? Because, you know, that's not the typical practice. That's not the preferred practice. It's expected only in those special circumstances, only for those that are on their deathbed. And here he is, he's all better now. So what do we do? And there's a big question about that. And there's a big question when he becomes a presbyter and becomes a bishop about you know, the validity of his salvation and the validity of his baptism becomes a big point of controversy. And then there's the baptism of children, and this, in many cases, is an instance of necessity. It doesn't really become common until the 5th and 6th century, although it is mentioned in Hippolytus. It becomes really a practice that's more common later on. So let's take a minute and read some of these quotes that talk about this. I think this is pretty interesting. From Hippolytus, Apostolic Tradition, chapter 17, he writes, catechumens will hear the word for 3 years. Yet if somebody is earnest and perseveres well in the matter, it is not the time that is judged, but the conduct. And so what he says here is that, you know, if you are going through the process of catechesis, if you're going and you are a candidate to become a Christian, a candidate for baptism, then it takes you 3 years of learning and 3 years to develop. However, if you're just, you know, exceptional and you're doing really, really well, we might shorten that based on, you know, your good conduct. But it was a rigorous thing. And it's interesting how that often differs from so many of us, how we practice. And, you know, there's, I think, sometimes a tendency just to hurry up and dunk people. And I think that's a problem. But this is perhaps the opposite extreme, and they're taking a lot of time. Then you skip down in chapter 20, verses 1 and 2 of the same book. He says, when they're chosen who are to receive baptism, let their lives be examined, whether they have lived honorably while catechumens, whether they honored the widows, whether they visited the sick, whether they have done every good work. If those who bring them forward bear witness for them that they have done so, well, then let them hear the gospel. And so you have this similar indication. You know, while you're a catechumen, while you're going through the process, you are expected to do a lot of things. You're expected to be living and learning and, you know, developing. You know, it's a process. He'll talk about, you know, what if you're a catechumen, and this is during a time of great persecution, and what if you are to be martyred? I didn't put the quote up here, but he says, well, if you have not yet been baptized, but you express your faith and you don't deny and you go to your death professing Christ, well, you don't have to worry because you've been baptized in your own blood. And so the death of martyrs counts as a baptism for those who have not yet been baptized, which is kind of an interesting concept. He'll go on to say, chapter 21, this is a little bit of a longer one, but this is really in depth about how the actual baptism process works for Hippolytus. He says, then after these things, the bishop passes each of them on nude to the elder who stands at the water, or presbyter there. They shall stand in the water naked. A deacon likewise will go down with them into the water. When each of them is to be baptized, has gone down into the water, the one baptizing shall lay hands on each of them, asking, "Do you believe in God, the Father Almighty?" And the one being baptized shall answer, "I believe." He shall then baptize each of them once, laying his hand upon each of their heads. Then he shall ask, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who was born of the Holy Spirit, and the Virgin Mary, who is crucified under Pontius Pilate, and died, and rose on the third day, living from the dead, and ascended into heaven, and lay down at the right hand of the Father, the one coming to judge the living and the dead?" And when each has answered, "I believe," he shall baptize a second time. Then he shall ask, "Do you believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Church, the resurrected flesh?" And then each being baptized shall answer, "I believe." And thus let him baptize the third time. And so here you have 3 baptisms, and all taking place in one occurrence, this triple immersion that happens. This sounds very familiar to the Apostles' Creed, right? What he's quoting here is essentially the Apostles' Creed. He kind of breaks it down into these different chunks. But this confession that they're confessing is the Apostles' Creed that we were talking about. And so this is the standard practice in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, at least by the end of the 2nd and through the 3rd centuries. You have, we'll move on then, I guess. Talking about Christian assemblies. So baptism is the rite of initiation, and it is clearly expressed in not just virtually, in every early church father that you read. All the apostolic fathers, those writing in the late 1st and through the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, there's a universal recognition that baptism is the line of demarcation in which your sins are atoned for. And they all speak of baptism as being for the removal of sins. So that's very significant. What about the Christian worship? How does that work? How do Christian gatherings go? We have often in our own context, we have pretty strict things about how things go. We always meet at such and such a time at a designated church building, and we have the same structure every week with songs and prayers and Lord's Supper and preaching, and it's very systematized often. And so what did that look like for the early church? Well, you have churches met on the first day of the week, which they called the Lord's Day. This is significant because this is a departure from the Jews. And they're very, very clear to talk about this being the first day of the week. And when Christians talk about this, and even Gentiles are going to notice that there's a distinction here between the practice of the Christians and the practice of the Jews, that the Christians meet on the first day, which is distinct from the Sabbath. It is not the same thing. And Christians would typically meet at the break of day, really early in the morning, and then they would break for a long period of time, and they would come back at the very end of the day. This is probably because Sunday was not a day off, right? We live in a time where we have weekends, Saturday, Sunday. Everybody gets off for the most part, work and businesses, and they shut down and all of that. That's not the case. The Roman work week was 7 days a week, and there were no set days off. And so if you have a group that's living under Roman rule in the world, which Rome controlled the whole world just about, they're going to be forced to work on Sunday, just like they work on every other day of the week. There were some special dispensations that were made for the Jews. The Jews, because of their special status in Rome, were given Saturdays off. And that's part of the animosity towards the Jews at the time, is they're seen as really lazy because they didn't work 7 days a week like everybody else. They worked 6 days a week, and the government protected that day off. And so This is going to be an interesting thing. Pliny the Elder, or Pliny the Younger, rather, he's going to write in his letter to the Emperor Trajan about 112 AD, and he's going to describe this a little bit, and we're going to read that here in a second. Justin Martyr is going to talk about this as well. As far as where do Christians meet, well, early on, they meet often in homes. I think you see that pretty clearly in the New Testament. Talks about the household of Chloe and things like that are pretty likely the standard practice for the early church. They met. You have a wealthy member. They host people in their home, and perhaps that location of where the church meets is not necessarily set. Perhaps we're going to meet here for a little while, and we're going to meet over there for a little while, and perhaps there's some migration that happens. The early church did not meet exclusively in homes. The word home in Greek is oikos, and that word can refer to things outside of physical residence. You often have different Gentile religious groups or social clubs and things like that meet, and the gathering places of those social clubs or whatever it might be are called oikos. And they're called houses. And so it's kind of like, where does the Lion Club meet? We might call it a clubhouse or something like that. Well, they had a similar thing with the social clubs of that time. So the word house does not necessarily indicate, the actual house that somebody lives in. It could be just kind of a public gathering place for the group. And so, certainly, as the church goes on, though, they begin to have more set locations, physical locations. Churches begin to rent. Churches begin to buy plots of land to build some buildings, remodel buildings, especially in some wealthier places where there's wealthier churches. That becomes the place, becomes the thing that they do. And so that you have meeting places. Interestingly, they have divided worship, and not just the kind of division that you see in maybe some old-style churches, even here in America, where men sit on one side and women sit on one side. Certainly, that was the practice, but they had divided between those who were portions of the worship that were open to some and not open to others. The first part of worship services were open for anybody. They were open for anyone who would hear. And so these are the portions that, contain the preaching and the teaching. You want people who are not Christians to come and hear the gospel and to respond to it. These are portions that often contain hymns and prayers and those sorts of things. And after that first portion had concluded, those that were not Christians, those that were not baptized, were ushered out. And the final part, the second portion, was for the baptized exclusively. And that's the portion where they do things like take the Eucharist. And this is heavily focused around the taking of the Eucharist. And so this is kind of an interesting thing, because they often use very realist language when they talk about the Eucharist. Most of the Protestant world, at least, when we talk about the Lord's Supper, when we talk about communion, we understand it to be a metaphorical type thing, right? That you're not literally ingesting the literal flesh and blood of Jesus. And yet we still use the terms, flesh and blood and all of that. I'd say that's probably where some people were at this point. There's also today large religious groups, the non-Protestant groups, specifically Catholics and Anglicans and, those kind of groups that believe in what's called transubstantiation, which is that in the taking of the Lord's Supper, the bread does not become, is not just bread, it literally becomes the flesh of Jesus. And the juice, the fruit of the vine, the wine that you take is not just that it literally becomes the blood of Jesus. Its substance is transformed into the physical blood and the physical flesh of Jesus. And certainly there's beginnings of that in this time period as well. And so there's use of realist language concerning the Eucharist. And you can imagine, when we talked a couple weeks ago about the persecution that the early church faces, some of the charges that are made against them, one of the most pervasive charges is the accusation of cannibalism. These Christians are cannibals. They talk about eating flesh and drinking blood, and so that's used in the prosecution of Christians. And you can imagine why this practice of two divided worship services can lead to that, because you had the part that's open for everybody, and then the part of the inner circle, those that are baptized, they usher out all those outsiders, and then they partake in the eating of flesh and the drinking of blood. And so that is used, this divided worship service is used, especially in the prosecution of Christians. And so this is going to be a big issue for Christians, and a big way of how worship is actually carried out. You have the rise of sacraments that become a more and more of an issue. We talked about this a little bit last week, but the Latin sacramentum, the Greek mysterion, which means secret. The secret here is the mystery of the imputation of God's grace. It's a mystery to behold. And so sacraments are now developed into a doctrine that says, by partaking in these rituals and these physical elements, this is the moment where God's blessings and God's grace is given to you. There's been a transition here. Remember, we talked last week about how, from the biblical period, Peter says we're all a royal nation, we're all a royal priesthood, a people for God's own possession. There's the sanctification belongs to the saints, and the saints are all Christians. Well, now it has transitioned from that to the cult of the martyrs, from the cult of the martyrs to this. And to receive God's blessings, to receive God's grace, you have to partake in the Eucharist. They're vehicles of grace, so to speak. And so these sacraments are baptism. They believe that baptism is the line of demarcation where one receives salvation. And that's not necessarily incorrect. That is correct. They talk about the Eucharist, where one receives weekly, or perhaps however often they take. Perhaps they don't take it weekly at this point, though they typically did. They receive God's grace. And so if you fail to be baptized, you don't receive God's grace. If you fail to take the Eucharist, if you fail to take the Lord's Supper, you don't have God's grace. And then they also add chrism, which is the anointing of oil. And that's also a significant thing. And we still see that in lots of different religious groups around the world today. And so all of these are significant. This becomes more and more a thing, and it becomes, from here on out, really, it's not going away. It's still here today. But this is a development that has been in the process, but now around the 3rd century has become full-blown accepted. So here's an excerpt from the letter of Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan. We read this before in a previous class, but here's just a little part that talks about it. Remember, Pliny is talking to Trajan and saying, hey, there's these Christians, and I don't know what to do with them. They don't seem to be breaking any laws, but I know that we're supposed to kind of prosecute them, so what do you want me to do? And this is what he says. He says, they asserted, however, that the sum of the substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meeting on the fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but to not commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. And so you have this interesting, they meet very early in the morning, and, as far as I can tell, they're not doing anything wrong. They sing hymns to Christ as to a God, and they gather together in worship, and, they're not like pledging themselves to a life of crime or anything. They're doing the opposite. They're saying, let's not commit fraud. Let's not commit theft. Let's not commit adultery. And then they depart, probably to go to work for the day. And then they come back later and they eat together. And this is probably talking about the love feast that I believe it's Jude talks about, a frequent gathering and sharing of a meal that the early church did. And so this is interesting. Even Pliny, a Roman governor, a Roman citizen, an outsider, he is not a Christian by any means. He's recognizing that there's really nothing at fault here, and given some details about their practice. You have a quote from Justin Martyr, who is going to be mid-1st century or mid-2nd century rather, and this is what he talks about. On the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read. Well, what's that? The memoirs of the apostles. That's the Gospels. Writings of the prophets. That's probably either Old Testament, probably even New Testament there as well, are read as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president, the one presiding there, not like a president of the United States or anything, probably the bishop, not necessarily the bishop of the church, verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray, and as we before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayers and thanksgiving according to his ability, and the people assent, saying Amen. And there is distribution to each, and participation of that which thanks has been given. And those who are absent, a portion is sent by the deacons. And so again, you have, you got hymns, you've got prayer, you've got preaching, you've got, the taking of the Lord's Supper, bread and wine. It looks like they share a meal together as well. And then you have a collection that's gathered for those that are in need. And so what you see here is really similar to what we do today, because it's, very old. So let's talk about the role of women in the church. And, there's not a huge amount written by writers from this time period about women in the church. However, women did not, what we can gather, women did not generally fill positions of leadership or public teaching in mainstream churches. That's obviously in alignment with what Paul teaches and the other apostles teach. A notable exception to that is what we talked about a couple weeks ago with heresies. You had the Montanist group that come around, and they're claiming special new revelations and from God, and they claim that Jesus is coming back in Phrygia, and they got all those beliefs. If you remember, Montanus is accompanied by two women that are his co-prophetesses. They're the ones that receive revelation with him, and they're a very strange kind of charismatic group. That's outside the mainstream. That's not the norm. In most mainstream churches, women are not fulfilling, leadership roles. You're not having women presbyters. You're not having women bishops. That will change to some degree in some coming centuries. Around the 5th century onward, you'll see especially women deacons and some things like that. But that's not the case in the early church. And certainly not the case in this time period, and certainly not the case in the very early church. We do see that they perform evangelistic functions in private or all-female groups. They often accompany evangelists. They often accompany missionaries on their journeys, but not in the same public capacity that the men will perform in. Many women were martyred. There's a lot of stories of women that were martyred for their faith, just like men were. In this time period, there's the not deification, but almost deification of martyrs. The martyrs were special in their faith because they're the ones that really gave it all, just like Jesus did. Martyrs were the ones that, the teaching was that they don't have to wait in line. They don't have to wait in the intermediary waiting place. They get to go straight to heaven. And so there's all these teachings about martyrdom. Well, many women are martyrs. And so there's some importance there. According to the New Testament, this is a quote from Everett Ferguson. He wrote a book about the role of women in this time period. He says, according to the New Testament, some activities and assemblies are forbidden to women, bringing the word of God to the people, whether teaching, edification, exhortation, or consolation, acting as a representative of the church, as in leading of prayer, or assuming the leadership of an assembly, leading of singing, presiding over the meeting as a whole, or parts thereof, like the Lord's Supper. You have a quote from Jack Lewis. He did a lecture on women's role in worship. And he says, it's not until one comes to the church orders of the 3rd century that the practice of appointing female deacons is met. Even at that time, these women were not functioning in oral roles in worship. They aided at female baptisms, were doorkeepers, seeing that women were seated in proper places, and aided widows. The texts of this period also known order of widows, not merely as recipients of charity, but as part of a church organization. And so, the emergence of women in leadership roles, even when it begins to start to be a thing, it's not full-blown, not public leadership roles, and generally assigned exclusively to females within the church. Certainly not what we see in a lot of churches today. This is a list of roles that women perform that Dr. Brumback gave in his lecture. He said, we see women serve as Jesus' benefactors. We see that in Luke chapter 8. We see Dorcas provides clothing for others in the book of Acts. We see Philip's daughter are prophetesses, and that prophesying should probably be understood in the context of in light of the rest of what Scripture says about the role of women and all of that. We see Paul calls the mother of Rufus his own mother, a very important role there. 1 Timothy chapter 6, we see that women play important roles in rearing of children, showing hospitality, good works, teaching other women, managing households, and various other things. We see women host churches in their homes. And so often I think when we talk about the role of women, we can be in the problem of saying this is the checklist of things they can't do, and we often fail to talk about the things that they can do. And so I think that's a pitfall. But certainly Christian women in this time period is not egalitarian. It is not total equity between men and women. There are different distinctions and different roles. And even when those roles begin to blur a little bit, it is not the same neighborhood of what we see today. So let's spend the time we got left, and we'll go through this a little bit fast. But let's talk about some important figures. I know we've mentioned a lot of these people in some other classes, and it's kind of hard to get your head around who these people are because they got weird names. They're all from weird places, and they're all bishop of so-and-so and bishop of here and there. And so it can be confusing, and just to try and get some, sketches with names with the faces, or faces with the names. Maybe this will help you kind of get a little bit of an idea who these people were. This is definitely by no means exhaustive of some influential people, but these are some major influential characters in this time period. You have Irenaeus of Lyon, and he is going to be living from around 130 to 202 AD. All of these dates we're going to say are approximations, best guesses, but maybe off by a little bit. But 130 to 202 from Lyon, Gaul. Gaul is modern-day France, and so we didn't talk about it much when we talked about the persecutions, but if you might remember, we mentioned briefly the martyrs of Lyon. It's a site of some serious persecution, and Irenaeus is going to be the bishop of Lyon. He is going to be primarily a Greek speaker, which is going to be significant. There's going to be a transition that's about to happen. At this point, virtually the whole church worldwide, Greek is their primary language. Whether you're in Rome or whether you're in, Ephesus or wherever you might be in Jerusalem, the primary language of the church is going to be Greek. There's going to be a transition, though, and it's going to begin with one of these figures we're going to talk about next, Tertullian. But there's going to be a transition from the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The language is going to shift. The church in the East, by East we mean like West Asia and that sort of area, Ephesus, Jerusalem, most of those big churches, they're going to continue to speak Greek. Whereas the church in the West, which is going to be heavily Roman, they're going to speak Latin. And that's going to be really important. This class is called From Church History from Christ to Schism. Some spoiler, there's going to be a big divide between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. That's where we're going to be ending this class. But a major contributor to that is going to be different languages are spoken. But at this point, Irenaeus, he speaks Greek. Some background to who he is going to be a student of Polycarp, which is, you may remember Polycarp as one of the apostolic fathers. He wrote a couple letters. He was good friends with Ignatius, the one that really promoted the elevation of bishops. Polycarp is associated with the Apostle John. So I guess in a way, Irenaeus is kind of like the student grandchild equivalent of the Apostle John. I guess if you want to say it that way, but probably don't want to say it that way. But later in life, he is going to relocate to Lyon in Gaul, and he is going to serve as a presbyter and then eventually the bishop there. He's going to have some major contributions. We talked about him primarily last week, talking about his contribution to the Easter controversy or the Paschal controversy. He's going to have a very big voice in that. There's the division over whether do we celebrate Easter on the 14th of Nisan, regardless of whenever that falls in the year, or do we celebrate it on a Sunday near the spring equinox, or what do we do? He's going to have a big voice in that. He's going to be have a big pushback against Gnosticism, which has been creeping and growing and becoming really significant in this time period. And he's also going to, in his defense against Gnosticism, which we talked about last week, he's going to promote apostolic successionism, which is that doctrine that as a church, the authority of the apostles has passed down to their students and their students to their students and bishop to bishop and bishop to bishop. And so as a church, you really ought to be able to trace back your spiritual ancestry to the apostles. And so Irenaeus is going to be a big emphasizer of that doctrine. And he's also going to be an important voice in the canon discussion, which we talked about last week. Some of the works that he's going to write against heresies, which we read a little bit excerpt of, which is going to really push back against Gnosticism. And the way he does that is through apostolic successionism. And then proof of apostolic preaching is going to be another important work that he does. Then you got Tertullian of Carthage. Carthage is an interesting place. Carthage is in North Africa. And prior to Rome becoming the empire, when it was a republic, Rome had a series of wars with North Africa, with Carthage. Rome was not quite the world superpower that it was going to come to be. Carthage was about an equal size power to Rome, and they had a big war called the Punic Wars. And I'm getting off on a tangent, but it's the coolest thing that you can ever imagine is a Carthaginian general named Hannibal marched elephants across the Swiss Alps into Italy in this war. And that's just a mind-boggling thing. Try and imagine fighting an elephant on foot with a spear. But anyway, he is from Carthage. After the Punic Wars, Rome obliterates Carthage, salts the land, and then takes over the land for itself. So despite being associated with Carthage, he is Roman. He is going to be the first Latin church father, Latin-speaking church father. He's going to be called the father of Latin Christianity. And he's going to still speak Greek, but he's going to work primarily in Latin. He was born to a well-to-do Roman family of some Roman government officials. He himself will be a Roman government official. He's going to live in Rome for quite a while. And then when he's middle-aged, he's going to convert to Christianity, eventually move to Carthage, Africa, and become eventually the bishop of Carthage. We mentioned last week that he is not remembered fondly in Catholic circles or Orthodox circles either, for that matter. And the reason for that is, although he does a lot of very good works and writes a lot of things that are very interesting and significant, he's going to join the Montanists at the end of his life, which is a heretical group. So some of the good things that he does is he defends against Gnosticism and Marcionism. He's going to be a very strong opponent to those and really call them out and make fun of them. Just kind of mock them for their foolishness. He is going to coin a lot of really significant terms that we're going to use for going forward. So up to this point, when we've talked about some religious terms, we've been using mostly Greek-based terminology. Eucharist, that's a Greek word. From this point on, we're going to start using a lot of Latin-based terminology. And that's in large part thanks to Tertullian. He's going to be the one who coins the phrase Trinity. Obviously, Trinity is not a word that appears in the Bible, but he is going to be credited for that, as well as quite a few other significant terms. His reputation is going to be ruined when he joins the Montanists at the end of his life, and it's kind of sad for him that he joined that group. But some of his important works against Marcion, as you can tell, he's against Marcion. Against Praxeas. Praxeas was a very famous Gnostic teacher of his age, and so his two most famous works are against these heresies that are rampant in his time. You're going to have Clement of Alexandria. He is going to be living 150 to 215 A.D. In Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria, Egypt is a powerhouse of, intellectual powerhouse of the ancient world. It's a city that was named after Alexander the Great because he established it. It's where Alexander the Great was buried, and very significant city. It's going to have a very large Jewish population. You're going to have a lot of significant Jewish figures like Philo of Alexandria come out of there. It's the place where the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, is going to be written. Part of the reason for that is Egypt is very wealthy. Egypt has a lot of papyrus. Papyrus is like a reed-type plant that you can make. You don't have modern paper, and so you write on papyrus. And papyrus is as close to paper as you're going to get in the ancient world. And so there's lots of books that are written in Alexandria, and Alexandria becomes famous for its library and philosophy and all of these sorts of things. And so you have Clement of Alexandria, who spent a lot of his life going around, growing up in Greece, learning from all these different schools of Greek thought, from Stoics and from Platonists and from Aristotelians and from all these different Greek philosophies. He's going to convert to Christianity and realize that Christianity is the true philosophy. And so he's going to eventually migrate down to Alexandria and open his own school where he teaches philosophy from a Christian perspective for believers and non-believers alike. And he's going to be very influential in that. So some of the things he's famous for: he really integrates Greek philosophy with Christianity, particularly Platonism. Plato is all about the world of forms, the world of shadows. You have earthly things that are just a shadow of the true spiritual thing, which is in heaven, is what Plato teaches. And Clement of Alexandria is going to adopt a lot of those ideas and integrate those into Christianity. He's going to be big on allegory, and we've talked about how out of hand allegory gets at times. The Epistle of Barnabas talks about how, when Abraham circumcised all of those, I don't even remember the number, 317 or something, men, how that's really an allegory for Christ and for Jesus. And he's got this really convoluted reasoning as to why he thinks that. But he's going to be a big proponent for allegory. And allegory is going to be really, really common mode of interpretation in this time period. And he's going to have a big impact on Origen, who we're going to talk about next. But so that's going to be really big. Some of his big works: Exhortation to the Greeks. You can imagine he's going to talk a lot about philosophy, because that's what Greeks like in this work. The Instructor, or the Pedagogue, which is a work that talks about teaching and how to teach, and then a work about miscellaneous topics. And so that's Clement. Clement is going to have a big impact on Origen of Alexandria, who's going to be just a generation later. Origen is a very controversial figure. Origen's also going to be a Greek speaker. He has a very fascinating background. We talked about him a little bit when we talked about persecution, but when Origen is 18 years old, his dad, Leonidas, is going to be martyred under the persecution of Septimus Severus in around 202 to 203. And as his father was about to go be martyred for his faith, Origen comes and speaks to him and says, "Don't you dare refuse. You go to your death." And he encourages his dad at the age of 18 to go willingly to his own death, a death of a martyr. And that's a really powerful thing. Origen then, to support his family, because he was the oldest son, opens up a school. And he's very well educated, one of the most educated of these guys from this period. He opens up his own school, very inspired by Clement and the works that he does. He's going to be charged by the bishop, I think his name's Demetrius, to be in charge of the catechumens, of catechizing these initiates into the church. He is, however, going to be deemed a heretic after his death. He's going to be loved during his lifetime. People are going to be very fond of him, hold him in very high regard, but after his death, he's going to be deemed a heretic. He's going to argue for the philosophical rationality of Christianity, similar to Clement. But the doctrines that are going to get him in trouble is he's going to believe and teach the pre-existence of the soul. And so before God creates you as a human being in your mother's womb, you are a soul that existed before that and have always existed. And so the soul is not only eternal future-facing, but it's eternal backwards-facing. The problem with that is, and we'll talk about this perhaps a little bit more in a couple weeks when we talk about Trinitarianism, is that God alone is eternal. And God cannot, by definition, share his attributes. There's attributes of God that are mutable, and there's attributes of God that are immutable. There's attributes of God that are not. God's attributes are immutable. I was using the wrong term there. There's qualities of God that are shareable, communicable, and incommunicable. That's what I was trying to say. And so there's things that we can share with God, but there's things that belong to God alone. And the eternality of God, the backwards-facing, forward-facing eternality of God is something that belongs to God alone. And so this is going to be something that gets him in trouble after his death. And then he's also going to teach that salvation belongs to all souls, and that all souls are going to be saved, even the soul of the devil after a period of time. So he believes in hell, but he believes that after so long, souls that have been condemned can achieve salvation. And so obviously that's going to, upon some reflection in some coming centuries and coming years, people are going to take some severe issue with. But Origen is going to be pretty controversial after his death, but loved during his life. So some of his works, against Celsius. This is where Celsius is a critic of Christianity, a Greek a philosophical critic, and so he's going to argue for the rationality in this work, De Principiis, which is like a first principles, a kind of almost a catechetical type thing. He's going to write a bunch of commentaries and a bunch of exegetical works explaining the Bible and those sorts of things, way more than we have time to list. But this will be our last one, and then we'll wrap up. Finally, you have Eusebius of Caesarea. And he's a little bit later than these other guys, but we have been interacting with Eusebius a lot, whether you know it or not. So Eusebius lives 260 to 339 AD, and he lives in Caesarea, Palestine. And the reason why I'm using the word Palestine there is Palestine is the Roman word for this whole province, and Rome is in control here. And so, he lives in Caesarea, the same Caesarea that Jesus ministered in and lived in for a good while. And he is going to be famous. He's going to get his start because he's going to study with a guy by the name of Pamphilus, who is a Christian that's a big fan of Origen. And Eusebius, it's kind of ironic, he's remembered very fondly by many, although he sides with people that are not remembered fondly. And so he and his teacher, Pamphilus, are going to write a work together defending Origen for all that Origen does. And after the persecution of Diocletian comes, which is that really, really bad persecution that lasted probably the worst period of persecution in Christian history, he's going to flee from Caesarea to Tyre, and then from Tyre to Egypt. In Egypt, he's going to be apprehended, he's going to be arrested, and he's going to be thrown in prison. Fortunately, he is going to be able to wait it out. And in 311, we'll talk more about this later, you're going to have the Edict of Toleration, which is going to decriminalize Christianity, and he's going to be released. He's going to be famous because he plays a role in the Council of Nicaea, which we are going to talk about next week. He is going to, interestingly enough, side with Arius, who is not the one who's going to win the day. Yet, despite siding with Arius, he's not going to be fully sided with him. And interestingly, he's also going to be friends with the Emperor Constantine, and so he makes some powerful friends. He's going to then be commissioned to write a history of the church. And this is what he's famous for. He's the father of church history because he's the one who takes it upon himself to track down lots and lots of sources and write a very detailed history of the church, from the apostles moving on to his present day, up until the time of Constantine. And, you may not have known, we've not maybe talked about him much, but a lot of what we've talked about in this class has come straight from Eusebius's work and the things that he's recorded. How do we know about Marcion? Well, a lot of what we know about Marcion comes from Eusebius. A lot of what we know about some of these schismatic groups comes from Eusebius. A lot of what we know about the traditions about the deaths of the apostles comes from Eusebius. And so he's going to be a very significant person in that regard. So his famous work is the Historia Ecclesiasticus, or church history. He's going to write the Defense of Origin, Preparation for the Gospel, Proof of the Gospel, various other works that are not as significant, but he's going to be a big figure moving forward. We're going to, as we move forward, we're going to interact with him a lot less because we're moving past the time of his life. So, all that to say, we are wrapping up now, I guess. Church life was in a lot of ways similar, in a lot of ways different to that of today. They worshiped. Worship was important, and they were very heavily influenced by some significant figures, just as many significant figures today have had big wakes. So next week, we're going to talk about church councils. The first of those, the Council of Nicaea, and some of those things. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you guys for watching.